Sarah Chen had always been different from other women her age. At 28, she possessed a quiet confidence that made people look twice, though most couldn't quite put their finger on why. Her petite frame and gentle demeanor masked something far more formidable underneath. Those who knew her well understood that beneath her soft-spoken exterior lay the heart of a warrior. The small mountain town of Pine Ridge had become her sanctuary after leaving military service 2 years ago. She worked at the local veterinary clinic, treating injured animals with the same precision and care she had once applied to treating wounded soldiers in combat zones. The townspeople knew her as the kind woman who never charged full price for treating stray animals, who volunteered at the community center, and who could fix almost anything with her hands. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen had spent 8 years as a Marine Corps combat specialist, with 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 classified missions that would never appear in any official records. She had earned the respect of hardened veterans twice her size and had been personally commended by generals whose names appeared in history books. Her small hands had wielded weapons with deadly accuracy, and her quick mind had saved countless lives in situations where others would have frozen in panic. But Sarah had left that life behind, or so she thought. She had grown tired of the violence, the constant state of alertness, and the weight of decisions that meant life or death for others. When her final tour ended, she had quietly declined offers for promotion and lucrative private security positions. Instead, she chose Pine Ridge, specifically because it was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where the biggest excitement was the annual Harvest Festival, and where she could finally learn to sleep through the night without reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late September. Sarah was examining an injured hawk that a local farmer had brought in when she heard the rumble of vehicles outside the clinic. Through the window, she watched as 3 black SUVs pulled up across the street. The vehicles were too clean, too expensive for Pine Ridge, and they parked with military precision. Her trained eye immediately cataloged the details: government plates, tinted windows, and the subtle way the occupants surveyed the area before exiting. 6 men emerged from the vehicles, all wearing dark suits that didn't quite conceal the bulge of shoulder holsters. They moved with the disciplined coordination of a tactical team, spreading out to cover different angles of the street. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Federal agents, probably FBI or DEA, possibly military intelligence. Their presence in Pine Ridge could only mean trouble. Dr. Morrison, the elderly veterinarian who owned the clinic, noticed her sudden tension. "Everything all right, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." She forced a smile and gently set the hawk back in its carrier. "Just thought I recognized someone." "I'll be right back." Sarah stepped outside, ostensibly to water the flowers in the window boxes, but actually to get a better look at the agents. The team leader was a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was studying a photograph and comparing it to the buildings along Main Street. When his gaze swept toward the veterinary clinic, Sarah saw his eyes narrow with recognition. Her blood ran cold. Somehow, after 2 years of careful anonymity, they had found her. The leader gestured to his team, and 2 agents began walking toward the clinic, while the others took positions that would block any potential escape routes. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Had something from her past missions been compromised? Was this about the classified operation in Kandahar, where she had been the only survivor? Or worse, had someone discovered what really happened during those final weeks before her discharge? She ducked back inside the clinic, her training automatically taking over. In seconds, she had mentally mapped every exit, identified potential weapons within reach, and calculated the time it would take the agents to reach her position. The hawk in its carrier looked at her with bright, intelligent eyes, as if sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. "Dr. Morrison," she called softly, "I need you to take the hawk to the back room and stay there until I come get you." The old veterinarian looked confused but recognized the authority in her voice. "Sarah, what's going on? Please, just trust me. And whatever you hear, don't come out until I say it's safe." The front door chimed as the first agent entered. He was younger than the leader, with the cocky confidence of someone who believed his badge and gun made him invincible. His partner followed a step behind, hand resting casually on his weapon. "We're looking for Sarah Chen," the lead agent announced, flashing his credentials. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with her. Sarah emerged from behind the reception desk, her hands visible and empty. I'm Sarah Chen. What can I help you with? The agent's expression shifted slightly, as if he had expected someone different. Her calm demeanor and professional appearance clearly didn't match whatever profile they had been given. Ma'am, we need you to come with us for questioning in connection with a matter of national security. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but we strongly advise cooperation. Sarah knew the game. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest her, but they hoped to intimidate her into complying voluntarily. It was a standard tactic, and she had seen it used countless times during her military service. The problem was that they had no idea who they were dealing with. I'd like to see a warrant, she said quietly. The second agent stepped forward, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Ma'am, this is a matter of national security. We don't need a warrant for voluntary questioning. Then I voluntarily declined to be questioned. The lead agent's jaw tightened. Miss Chen, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. We have reason to believe you possess information vital to an ongoing investigation. Information that certain unfriendly parties would very much like to obtain. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her mind was working furiously. They weren't just here to question her, they thought she was a security risk. Someone had either leaked information about her past missions or had connected her to something she had hoped would stay buried forever. What kind of information? She asked. The kind that gets people killed if it falls into the wrong hands. Through the window, Sarah could see the other agents taking positions around the building. They had clearly expected this to be a simple pickup, but they were prepared for resistance. What they weren't prepared for was just how much resistance Sarah Chen could provide when cornered. The hawk in the back room let out a sharp cry, as if sensing the tension building in the front of the clinic. Sarah took that as her cue. Gentlemen, she said, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge, I warned you. I'm a Marine combat master. You might want to reconsider your approach. The agents exchanged glances, clearly not taking her seriously. The younger one actually smirked. Ma'am, we're federal agents. We're not impressed by military posturing. Sarah sighed softly. It always amazed her how people could look at her and see only what they expected to see, a small woman in scrubs working at a veterinary clinic. They never looked deeper, never noticed the way she moved with perfect economy of motion, or how her eyes constantly tracked potential threats and escape routes. I'm going to give you one more chance to walk away, she said. After that, I can't guarantee your safety. The lead agent reached for his handcuffs. Sarah Chen, you're coming with us one way or another. No, Sarah replied simply. I'm not. What happened next would be talked about in Pine Ridge for years to come, though most people would never believe the full truth of what they witnessed. In the space of 3 seconds, Sarah Chen transformed from a quiet veterinary assistant into something entirely different. A weapon honed by years of combat training and tempered by experiences that would have broken lesser people. The younger agent never saw her move. One moment she was standing behind the reception desk with her hands at her sides, and the next moment his weapon was gone and he was on the floor, clutching a wrist that would later be diagnosed as fractured in 3 places. The gun had somehow ended up in Sarah's hands, though no one would be able to explain exactly how she had crossed the 8 feet between them so quickly. The lead agent was faster, managing to clear his weapon from its holster before Sarah reached him. But speed was only part of the equation. Sarah moved like water flowing around his aim and striking with surgical precision. The gun went flying as the agent stumbled backward, both hands suddenly numb from nerve strikes that had been delivered with textbook accuracy. Stay down, Sarah advised quietly, the captured weapon held with professional competence. Both of you. Through the window, she could see the other agents reacting to the commotion inside. They were moving to surround the building just as she had expected, but they were operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a civilian who had gotten lucky against 2 of their colleagues. They had no idea that every step they took was being anticipated by someone who had spent years learning to think like the enemy. Sarah's mind was already 3 moves ahead. The clinic had 2 exits, the front door and a back entrance that led to the alley behind Main Street. The back door would be covered within minutes, but the basement had an old coal chute that opened onto the side street. Dr. Morrison had mentioned it during her first week, complaining about the draft it created in winter. "Who sent you?" she asked the lead agent, who was slowly getting to his feet while favoring his right shoulder. "You know I can't tell you that." Sarah's expression hardened. "Wrong answer." She moved again, this time to secure both agents' backup weapons and communications equipment. The younger agent was still on the floor, alternating between cursing and demanding medical attention for his wrist. His partner was watching Sarah with new respect, finally understanding that they had severely underestimated their target. "You're making this worse for yourself," the lead agent said. "Assaulting federal agents, resisting lawful detention." "There's nothing lawful about this," Sarah interrupted. "You have no warrant, no probable cause, and no jurisdiction for the kind of questioning you're proposing, which means someone sent you here unofficially." She was right, and they both knew it. The slight tightening around the lead agent's eyes confirmed what Sarah had already suspected. This wasn't an official federal investigation. Someone with enough pull to mobilize an FBI team was using government resources for their own agenda. The question was who, and what they wanted badly enough to risk exposing themselves. Outside, she could hear the other agents taking positions. They would be calling for backup soon, which meant Sarah had perhaps 10 minutes before Pine Ridge was swarming with law enforcement. She needed answers, and she needed an escape route. But first, she needed to make sure Dr. Morrison was safe. "Doctor," she called toward the back room. "Are you all right back there, Sarah?" "What in heaven's name is going on out there?" "Everything's under control. I need you to stay exactly where you are for a few more minutes." She turned back to the agents, who were both watching her with a mixture of wariness and grudging professional admiration. The lead agent in particular seemed to be reassessing everything he thought he knew about this operation. "Your intel was wrong," Sarah told him. "Whoever briefed you didn't tell you the whole truth about who you were coming to collect. Enlighten me." Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I spent 8 years in situations where the wrong decision meant body bags. I've been shot at by people who were a lot better at their jobs than you are at yours, and I've survived things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life." She ejected the magazines from both captured weapons and tossed the guns across the room, keeping the ammunition. It was a gesture of controlled aggression. She could have kept the weapons, but she was choosing not to escalate unnecessarily. "So here's what's going to happen," she continued. "You're going to tell me who really sent you and what they think I know. Then you're going to walk out of here and tell them that Sarah Chen doesn't exist anymore. She died in Afghanistan, along with a lot of other good people." The lead agent considered his options. His backup was in position, but after seeing what Sarah had done to 2 armed agents in a matter of seconds, he wasn't eager to test her limits further. And something in her voice when she mentioned Afghanistan made him think that she wasn't bluffing about her background. "There was a mission," he said finally. "Operation Nightfall. 3 years ago." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Operation Nightfall was supposed to be buried so deep that even the people who had authorized it would deny its existence. It had been a joint military intelligence operation to retrieve stolen weapons technology from a terrorist cell operating near the Pakistan border. Sarah had been part of a 6-person team tasked with infiltration and recovery. Only one member of that team had made it out alive. "Who wants to know about Nightfall?" she asked, though she was already beginning to suspect the answer. "Someone who thinks you brought something back that didn't belong to you." Sarah's jaw tightened. "The only thing I brought back was my life, and barely that. Maybe, but certain parties aren't convinced. They think you might have acquired certain items during the operation." "What kind of items?" The agent glanced at his injured partner, who was listening to every word despite his obvious pain. "The kind that could change the balance of power in the wrong hands." Sarah knew exactly what he was talking about. During the final hours of Operation Nightfall, when everything had gone catastrophically wrong and her team was being systematically eliminated by enemies who seemed to know their every move, she had made a decision that haunted her still. The mission objective, a prototype weapons guidance system worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had been within reach when the ambush began. She could have grabbed it and tried to complete the mission. Instead, she had chosen to destroy it rather than risk it falling into the wrong hands. The explosion that had eliminated the guidance system had also covered her escape, but it had taken the lives of her 5 teammates in the process. Now, 3 years later, someone believed she had lied in her debriefing reports. Someone thought she had taken the guidance system for herself rather than destroying it. The guidance system was destroyed, she said firmly. I watched it blow up. So you say, but the fact remains that no trace of it was ever found in the wreckage. Because there was no wreckage, the explosion vaporized everything within a 50-meter radius. The agent shrugged. Like I said, that's your story. But certain people want to be sure. Sarah realized she was in more trouble than she had initially thought. If someone with enough influence to mobilize federal agents believed she had stolen classified military technology, they wouldn't stop with a simple interview. They would tear her life apart looking for evidence, and they would use every resource at their disposal to make her talk, which meant she couldn't stay in Pine Ridge, and she couldn't rely on her carefully constructed civilian identity to protect her anymore. The sound of approaching sirens in the distance confirmed what Sarah already knew. Backup was arriving, and her window of opportunity was closing fast. She needed to move. And she needed to move now. Tell your bosses that Sarah Chen is exactly what her discharge papers say she is. A retired Marine who wants to be left alone, she said, already moving toward the back of the clinic. And tell them that if they keep pushing, they're going to discover just how much trouble one Marine combat master can cause when she sets her mind to it. The lead agent started to respond, but Sarah was already gone, moving through the clinic with silent efficiency. By the time the backup units arrived and began coordinating their assault on the building, she was 3 blocks away and thinking about her next move. Behind her, Pine Ridge was about to learn that their quiet veterinary assistant had been hiding secrets that ran deeper than any of them could have imagined. And somewhere in Washington, D.C. or Virginia, a group of very powerful people was about to discover that they had made a serious mistake. Sarah Chen was no longer the woman who had tried to disappear into civilian life. The events of this morning had awakened something that she had spent 2 years trying to bury. The Marine combat master was back, and she was not happy about being forced out of retirement. The abandoned mining facility 15 miles outside Pine Ridge had been Sarah's backup safe house since her second week in town. During one of her weekend hiking trips, she had discovered the forgotten complex tucked into a narrow canyon, invisible from the main road and protected by terrain that would make approach difficult for anyone who didn't know the area intimately. Sarah crouched behind a rusted piece of machinery, watching the facility's entrance through military-grade binoculars she had retrieved from one of several caches hidden throughout the mountains. 3 hours had passed since her escape from the veterinary clinic, and she had spent that time carefully working her way through the wilderness, using skills learned in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. The federal agents had responded exactly as she had predicted. Within an hour of her disappearance, roadblocks had appeared on every major route out of Pine Ridge. Helicopters were conducting grid searches of the surrounding forest, and she could see the heat signatures of search teams methodically working their way through the valley below. It was an impressive display of resources, but they were looking for someone who didn't want to be found, and Sarah Chen had been trained by the best in the world at becoming invisible. More concerning was what she had observed during her withdrawal from the town. The operation wasn't just federal agents anymore. Mixed in with the FBI tactical teams were soldiers in unmarked uniforms carrying equipment that suggested military intelligence involvement. Someone had escalated this situation far beyond a simple interview about a 3-year-old mission. As she watched, a convoy of black vehicles wound its way up the mountain road toward Pine Ridge. Even from a distance, Sarah could identify the distinctive profile of armored personnel carriers. Whoever was behind this operation had decided that overwhelming force was the answer to their Sarah Chen problem. They had made 2 critical mistakes. First, they had assumed that she was still the same person who had filed her discharge papers 2 years ago, someone worn down by war and looking for peace at any cost. Second, they had underestimated how much a Marine combat master could accomplish when every survival instinct she possessed was screaming that her life was in danger. Sarah's phone, a ruggedized military model she had kept despite her civilian life, buzzed with an encrypted message. Only 3 people in the world had this number, and 2 of them were supposed to be dead. The message was brief. Heard you're having company. Old friends want to help. Respond if you're still breathing. G. Sarah stared at the phone screen for a long moment. G was Gunny Sergeant Maria Garcia, her former team leader and one of the finest soldiers Sarah had ever known. According to official records, Garcia had died in a helicopter crash 6 months after Sarah's discharge. According to those same records, the crash had been an accident. Sarah had suspected otherwise, but she had been trying so hard to disappear into civilian life that she hadn't investigated. Now she was wondering if Garcia's death had been as fictional as Sarah's peaceful retirement was turning out to be. She typed a response. Breathing, situation fluid. Need intel on who's pulling strings. The reply came back within minutes. Corporate interests. Military contractors. People who think Nightfall tech still exists. Meet at the old place if you can. Bring everything you've got. The old place. Garcia was referring to a safe house they had established during training exercises in Colorado, a place known only to the members of their original team. If Garcia was alive and using that reference, it meant she had been monitoring the situation for some time. It also meant that Sarah's troubles were bigger than she had realized. Military contractors with enough influence to manipulate federal agencies didn't give up easily. They would keep pushing until they got what they wanted or until someone made them stop. Sarah began moving through the mining facility, retrieving supplies from caches she had established during her first months in Pine Ridge. Her paranoia, which had seemed excessive at the time, was now proving to be well-founded. Military equipment, cash, false identification documents, and weapons that definitely weren't available at the local sporting goods store. Everything she might need if her carefully constructed civilian life came crashing down. As she worked, her mind wandered back to Operation Nightfall and the events that had shaped everything that followed. The mission briefing had been routine. Infiltrate a terrorist compound, retrieve stolen weapons technology, eliminate any threats encountered. The kind of assignment her team had completed dozens of times in various theaters of operation. But Nightfall had been different from the beginning. The intelligence had been too clean, the terrorist positions too well known, the mission parameters too specific. Sarah had voiced concerns during the briefing, but she had been overruled by officers who seemed more interested in the potential value of the recovered technology than in the safety of the team tasked with retrieving it. The compound they had infiltrated turned out to be a trap. The terrorists had been expecting them, and they had been equipped with weapons and communication systems far beyond what a typical cell could afford. Sarah's team had walked into what amounted to a sophisticated ambush, planned and executed by people who knew exactly when and how they would approach the target. 5 good soldiers had died because someone had provided the enemy with detailed information about the mission. And now, 3 years later, those same people were apparently still concerned about what Sarah might know or what she might have taken from the site. The irony was bitter. Sarah had spent the last weeks of her military service convinced that someone in the command structure had betrayed her team. She had filed reports, requested investigations, and demanded answers. In response, she had been transferred to a desk job and strongly encouraged to consider early retirement. The message had been clear. Forget about Operation Nightfall, or face the consequences. Now the consequences were finding her anyway. Sarah finished loading her gear into a military-style backpack and began planning her route to Colorado. The meeting with Garcia would be dangerous, but she needed answers more than she needed safety. If Garcia was right about corporate interests being involved, then this situation was about more than classified technology. It was about money, and people would kill for a lot less than what the Nightfall guidance system was worth on the black market. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message wasn't from Garcia. Chen, we need to talk. Your current situation can be resolved peacefully if you're willing to listen to reason. There are people who want to help you, but they need to know that you're not a threat to national security. Please respond if you're willing to discuss terms. A friend. Sarah deleted the message without responding. A friend was intelligence community speak for someone who wanted to be helpful but didn't want their real identity known. The problem was that in Sarah's experience, anonymous friends usually turned out to be anonymous enemies wearing friendly masks. She was securing the backpack when she heard the distant sound of rotors. A helicopter was approaching the canyon, flying low and fast. Sarah moved to a position where she could observe without being seen and waited for the aircraft to come into view. It wasn't a search helicopter. The sleek black machine that settled onto the canyon floor was military, but not any model she recognized from standard service. the kind of aircraft that didn't appear in procurement records and didn't officially exist. 6 figures emerged from the helicopter, moving with the disciplined precision that marked them as elite operators. They wore no identifying patches or rank insignia, but their equipment and bearings suggested special operations background. Sarah watched through her binoculars as they began setting up what appeared to be a command post near the facility entrance. This changed everything. The federal agents and military intelligence teams were one thing. They were operating within normal channels, even if those channels were being manipulated by outside interests. But unmarked special operations soldiers suggested that someone had decided to take this situation completely off the books. Sarah's military training had included extensive education about black operations and the kind of people who carried them out. These weren't the kind of soldiers who asked questions or worried about legal niceties. They were tools pointed at targets and expected to eliminate problems with maximum efficiency and minimum publicity, which meant that Sarah's situation had just escalated from complicated to life-threatening. She began moving deeper into the mining facility, using passages and equipment rooms that would be difficult for the new arrivals to navigate without detailed knowledge of the layout. Her mind was already working through tactical problems: how many exits the facility had, what kind of weapons the soldiers were carrying, how long she could hold out if they decided to force entry. More importantly, she was thinking about why someone would escalate the situation to this level. Federal agents asking questions was one thing, but deploying black operations soldiers suggested that someone was desperate to contain whatever they thought Sarah represented. The guidance system from Operation Nightfall had been valuable, but not valuable enough to justify this level of response, which meant there was something else involved. Something that made Sarah's continued existence unacceptable to people with the power to field their own private army. Her phone buzzed once more. This time, the message was longer and more detailed. Sarah, this is Colonel Matthews. I know you remember me from the Nightfall debriefing. I'm sending this message to warn you that the situation has gotten out of hand. The people looking for you aren't interested in questioning you anymore. They've decided you represent an unacceptable security risk, and they've authorized permanent solutions. You need to disappear completely, and you need to do it now. Don't trust anyone who claims they want to help. Everyone involved in this situation has their own agenda, and none of those agendas include your continued well-being. Get out of the country if you can. Stay hidden until this blows over. That's an order from someone who still remembers what honor means. M. Colonel Matthews had been the officer who had conducted Sarah's final debriefing after Operation Nightfall. He had been one of the few people in the command structure who had seemed genuinely concerned about what had happened to her team, and he had been the one to suggest that Sarah might be happier in civilian life. If Matthews was warning her that the situation had escalated to lethal force, then Sarah's assessment had been correct. Someone had decided that the questions surrounding Operation Nightfall were worth killing to protect. Sarah deleted the message and powered down her phone. Electronic communications were now a liability she couldn't afford. From this point forward, she would have to assume that everything she said or transmitted was being monitored by people who wanted her dead. She moved to a position overlooking the command post the soldiers had established. Through her binoculars, she could see them setting up sophisticated communications equipment and what appeared to be a tactical operations center. This wasn't a search and rescue operation, or even a capture mission. This was preparation for a military assault. The question was whether they knew she was in the facility, or whether they were simply using it as a staging area for operations throughout the region. Either way, Sarah's presence here was now compromised. She needed to move, and she needed to have a plan that accounted for the fact that her enemies apparently had unlimited resources and no interest in taking her alive. As she watched, one of the soldiers began unpacking equipment that made Sarah's blood run cold. Man-portable sensors capable of detecting human heat signatures through concrete and steel. If they deployed that equipment and conducted a systematic sweep of the facility, her hiding places would become death traps. The time was running out. Sarah began gathering her essential gear and planning a route that would take her out of the facility without crossing the paths of the soldiers outside. The mining complex was larger than most people realized, with tunnels and passages that connected to natural caves in the surrounding mountains. If she moved carefully, she could disappear into the wilderness before the soldiers realized she had been there. But first, she needed to send a message to Garcia. If the situation was as bad as Colonel Matthews suggested, then Garcia might be walking into the same kind of trap that had killed their teammates 3 years ago. Sarah retrieved a backup communication device from her gear and composed a brief message using codes she and Garcia had developed during their time together. Hunting party has hounds. Old place compromised. Suggest new location and extreme caution. Package may be too hot to handle. She transmitted the message using a frequency and encryption method that would make it nearly impossible to trace or intercept, then destroyed the device. Garcia would understand the warning, and she would know that Sarah was still alive and thinking tactically. As Sarah prepared to leave the mining facility, she took one last look at the soldiers setting up their command post. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they had overwhelming advantages in firepower, technology, and resources. They were probably right about the first two, but they were making a critical mistake about the third. Resources weren't just about equipment and personnel. Resources were also about knowledge, experience, and the will to use both effectively. Sarah Chen had spent 8 years learning to survive in situations where being outgunned and outnumbered was just another tactical problem to solve. The soldiers outside might have better weapons and more support, but they were hunting someone who had been trained by the Marine Corps to be the kind of weapon that other weapons couldn't stop. They were about to learn the difference between being a soldier and being a warrior. And somewhere in the chain of command that had authorized this operation, people were about to discover that there were some fights that couldn't be won with money and influence alone. Some fights required actually understanding your enemy. They didn't understand Sarah Chen at all. But they were about to get an education. The Blackwater Gorge safe house had been abandoned for almost a decade, but Maria Garcia had maintained it with the paranoia of someone who understood that the war never really ended. Hidden in the Colorado Rockies, accessible only by a hiking trail that didn't appear on any official maps, it had been designed as a last resort refuge for operators who found themselves cut off from official support. Sarah approached the location with all the caution her training demanded. She had spent 4 days working her way across 3 states, using skills learned in the mountains of Afghanistan to avoid the dragnet that continued to expand behind her. Twice she had been forced to change course when aircraft appeared overhead, and once she had spent an entire night motionless in a drainage culvert while a convoy of military vehicles searched the area around her position. The hunters were good, but they were looking for someone who might run or hide. They weren't prepared for someone who was hunting them back. During her journey, Sarah had pieced together more details about the forces arrayed against her. Using internet cafes and public computers, she had researched the corporate connections Colonel Matthews had hinted at. The trail led through a maze of shell companies and government contracts, but the pattern was clear enough once you knew what to look for. Meridian Defense Solutions was the name that kept appearing in procurement records and personnel transfers. A private military contractor that had grown explosively in the years following the Afghanistan drawdown. Meridian specialized in advanced technology integration and strategic asset recovery. Their client list included several 3-letter agencies and a significant number of foreign governments with questionable human rights records. More importantly, Meridian's CEO was a man named Richard Blackwood, a former Army colonel who had been quietly forced into retirement after questions arose about his involvement in several classified operations that had gone sideways. The kind of questions that led to congressional hearings being held in closed sessions and personnel files being sealed for national security reasons. Sarah recognized the name from her own Operation Nightfall briefings. Colonel Blackwood had been one of the officers pushing for the mission to proceed, despite intelligence gaps and security concerns. He had also been one of the strongest advocates for rapid deployment of the recovered weapons technology, arguing that time was critical to maintaining American technological superiority. Now he was running a company that specialized in exactly the kind of advanced weapon systems that had been the target of Operation Nightfall. The connections were too convenient to be coincidental. The safe house appeared exactly as Sarah remembered it. A small cabin that looked abandoned from the outside, but concealed sophisticated defensive positions and communication equipment. As she approached through the tree line, her trained eye automatically cataloged the subtle signs that someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks on the access road, barely visible disturbances in the vegetation around the perimeter, and the faint electrical hum that indicated powered equipment running inside the structure. Garcia was waiting. Sarah spent 20 minutes conducting surveillance before she approached the cabin. Her paranoia had kept her alive for 4 days, and she wasn't going to abandon it now just because she was meeting a friend, especially since she wasn't entirely certain that Garcia was still a friend. The woman who answered Sarah's coded knock was older and harder than the Maria Garcia that Sarah remembered, but the eyes were unmistakable. Garcia had always possessed the kind of focused intensity that marked natural warriors, and the years since Operation Nightfall had refined that quality to an almost predatory edge. "You look like hell," Garcia said by way of greeting, stepping aside to let Sarah enter the cabin. "You look dead," Sarah replied. "I went to your funeral." Garcia's smile was grim. "Closed casket. Amazing what you can accomplish with dental records and a helicopter crash in deep water." The interior of the cabin was exactly what Sarah had expected: maps covering every wall, communication equipment that belonged in a military command center, and enough weapons to outfit a small army. Garcia had clearly been using this place as more than just a meeting location. "How long have you been planning whatever this is?" Sarah asked, gesturing at the equipment around them. "Since about 6 months after Nightfall," Garcia replied. "When I started asking the right questions and people started trying to kill me for asking them." Sarah settled into a chair that gave her clear lines of sight to both the door and window. Even among friends, she wasn't taking chances anymore. "Tell me about Meridian Defense." Garcia's expression darkened. "Smart girl. I was wondering if you'd figure out that connection. Blackwood was involved in the original mission planning. Now he's running a company that specializes in advanced weapons technology. The math isn't complicated." "The math is more complicated than you think," Garcia said, moving to a wall map that showed locations across the Middle East and Central Asia. "Meridian didn't just bid on contracts for the technology we were supposed to recover. They helped design the mission parameters. They provided the intelligence that led us into that ambush." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "They set us up. They set up the whole thing." Nightfall was never about recovering stolen technology. It was about field testing technology that Meridian had developed. They needed combat data to prove their systems could perform under real-world conditions. And they needed our team eliminated so we couldn't testify about what we'd seen. Garcia nodded grimly. 5 good soldiers died so that Richard Blackwood could prove to potential customers that his guidance systems were worth the asking price. And when you survived and started asking inconvenient questions, they decided you were a loose end that needed to be tied off. Sarah processed this information, fitting it into what she had observed over the past few days. "They think I kept something from the site. Some evidence of what really happened. Did you?" Sarah considered the question. She had been completely truthful in her debriefing reports about destroying the guidance system, but she hadn't mentioned everything she had seen during the final hours of the operation. The terrorists had been using communication equipment that was far too sophisticated for their supposed organizational level. They had known the exact composition and capabilities of Sarah's team, and most importantly, they had been coordinating their attacks using tactical procedures that suggested military training at the highest levels. "I saw things," Sarah admitted, "things that suggested the whole operation was compromised from the beginning." "What kind of things?" Sarah described the communication intercepts she had recorded during the firefight, the tactical movements of the enemy forces, and the weapons they had been using. Equipment that should have been available only to First World military forces, deployed by people who understood exactly how to use it most effectively. Garcia listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally checking references on her computer. When Sarah finished, Garcia was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. "You recorded communication intercepts?" Garcia finally asked. "Standard procedure. Emergency battlefield intelligence gathering. Do you still have the recordings?" Sarah hesitated. She had kept copies of everything from Operation Nightfall, hidden in a safe deposit box under an assumed name. The recordings, along with after-action reports and personal observations that had never made it into official channels, represented the only evidence that the mission had been anything other than what appeared in the classified files. "Maybe," Sarah said carefully. Garcia's expression sharpened. "Sarah, those recordings could be the proof we need to expose what really happened. If we can demonstrate that the enemy was using Meridian technology during the ambush, we can prove that the whole operation was a setup. Or we can get ourselves killed before we have a chance to prove anything. How many people do you think Blackwood is willing to eliminate to protect a billion-dollar defense contract? As many as it takes, Garcia admitted. But that's exactly why we have to move fast. Every day we wait, he gets stronger and we get more isolated. Sarah understood the tactical logic, but she also understood the reality of their situation. They were two former soldiers with limited resources going up against a defense contractor with government connections and unlimited financing. The smart move would be to disappear completely, find new identities, and hope that Meridian eventually decided they weren't worth the continued effort. But Sarah had tried the disappearing act, and it hadn't worked. Blackwood's people had found her anyway, which meant they would keep looking until the problem was permanently resolved. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "What are you proposing?" Sarah asked. Garcia moved to another wall map, this one showing the United States with various locations marked in red. Meridian has facilities in 12 states. Most of them are legitimate research and development operations, but 3 of them are black sites that don't appear in any public records. Off-the-books operations where they test weapons systems that haven't been approved for official use. You want to hit one of their facilities? I want to hit the facility in Nevada. It's where they're developing the next generation of the guidance system we were supposed to recover in Afghanistan. If we can get inside and document what they're doing, we'll have proof that the technology existed before Operation Nightfall ever happened. Sarah studied the map, automatically analyzing approach routes and defensive positions. The Nevada facility was located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by desert that would make covert approach difficult but would also limit the defenders' options for calling in support. Security, military contractors. Former special operations, well-equipped but not expecting trouble. The kind of people who are good at their jobs but who think in terms of perimeter defense rather than active threats. Numbers? Best estimate is 20 to 30 personnel on site at any given time, but most of them are technical staff. Maybe 8 to 10 actual security personnel. Sarah considered the tactical challenges. With proper planning and the element of surprise, 2 experienced operators could probably penetrate the facility's defenses. Getting back out with useful intelligence would be more complicated, especially once the alarm was raised. What about extraction? Once we're inside, Meridian is going to throw everything they have at containing us. That's where it gets interesting, Garcia said, producing a tablet computer with detailed satellite imagery of the Nevada facility. The site is built on an old military installation that was abandoned in the 1990s. Underground tunnels, multiple access points, and terrain features that favor defenders who know the layout. You've been there, twice. Reconnaissance missions to map the facility and identify vulnerabilities. I know every guard post, every patrol route, and every escape route within 5 miles of the target. Sarah examined the satellite images, noting the defensive positions and natural approaches that Garcia had identified. The plan was audacious but feasible, assuming they could maintain surprise long enough to reach their objective. What's the real purpose of this operation, Maria? What are we actually trying to accomplish? Garcia's expression became grim. We're trying to stay alive, Sarah. Blackwood isn't going to stop hunting us until we're dead or until he's in prison. Those are the only 2 ways this ends. And you think exposing Meridian's illegal weapons development will be enough to bring him down? I think it's the only chance we have. The government contracts he's holding are worth billions of dollars. If we can prove that he's been conducting unauthorized weapons testing and that he engineered the deaths of American soldiers to cover it up, even his political connections won't be able to protect him. Sarah nodded slowly. The logic was sound, but she also understood that they would only get one chance to make their case. If they failed to gather sufficient evidence, or if they were captured or killed during the attempt, Blackwood would simply bury the truth along with their bodies. Time frame? Sarah asked. 48 hours. There's a new moon tomorrow night, which gives us optimal conditions for the approach, and my intelligence suggests that Blackwood is planning to move the facility's operations within the next week, which means this might be our last chance to find the evidence we need. Sarah considered everything Garcia had told her. The plan was dangerous, probably suicidal, and would likely result in both of them being hunted by every law enforcement agency in the country. On the other hand, doing nothing would certainly result in their deaths, probably sooner rather than later. Equipment? Sarah asked. Garcia smiled for the first time since their reunion. I've been collecting gear for 3 years. We'll have everything we need and some things they won't be expecting. Sarah looked around the cabin once more, taking in the weapons, maps, and communication equipment that Garcia had assembled. It was the kind of preparation that suggested someone who had been planning for this confrontation from the beginning, someone who understood exactly what they were up against. "All right," Sarah said finally. "But we do this my way once we're inside. No unnecessary risks, no heroics, and we extract the moment we have what we came for." "Agreed," Garcia replied. "But Sarah, you need to understand something. Even if we succeed, even if we expose everything Meridian has been doing, our lives are going to change forever. We'll be targets for every enemy Blackwood has made over the years, and we'll never be able to go back to normal civilian lives." Sarah thought about the veterinary clinic in Pine Ridge, about Dr. Morrison and the injured hawk, about the quiet life she had tried to build after leaving the military. All of that was gone now, destroyed by forces that had been set in motion 3 years ago by people who valued profit more than human life. "Normal was always an illusion," Sarah said. "At least this way we get to choose how the story ends." Garcia began gathering equipment from various caches around the cabin. "In that case, let's go write an ending that Richard Blackwood is going to regret for the rest of his life." As they prepared for what would certainly be the most dangerous mission either of them had ever attempted, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. For 3 years, she had been running from the ghosts of Operation Nightfall. Now it was time to confront them directly. The Marine Combat Master was going to war once more, but this time she was fighting for something more important than political objectives or national interests. This time she was fighting for the truth. The Meridian Defense Facility in Nevada sprawled across 20 acres of desert scrubland, its low-profile buildings and carefully maintained perimeter giving it the appearance of a legitimate research installation. But Sarah's trained eye could see the details that revealed its true nature. Guard towers designed to look like communication arrays, vehicle barriers disguised as landscaping features, and sensor networks that extended far beyond what any civilian facility would require. Sarah and Garcia had spent the day in observation, studying guard rotations and identifying the patrol patterns that would govern their approach. The facility operated on military time, with shift changes occurring every 6 hours and maintenance windows that provided brief opportunities for penetration. "Target building is the central research facility," Garcia whispered, pointing through binoculars at a structure that appeared to be the most heavily defended on the site. "Intelligence suggests that's where they're conducting weapons testing, and where any documentation about the original guidance system would be stored." Sarah studied the approach routes they had identified during their reconnaissance. The facility's designers had assumed that any threat would come from ground-based assault, but they had underestimated the advantages that could be gained by operators willing to use the terrain creatively. "Entry point?" Sarah asked. "Service tunnel that connects to the old military installation's underground network. It comes up inside the research building's basement level, bypassing most of the perimeter security." Sarah nodded. It was a classic infiltration route. Use the target's own infrastructure against them. The kind of approach that worked brilliantly when the defenders weren't expecting it, but became a death trap if the element of surprise was lost. They moved into position as the sun set behind the mountains, waiting for full darkness before beginning their approach. Sarah's equipment included everything she might need for a combat mission: weapons, communication gear, demolition charges, and medical supplies. But more importantly, she carried the recording device and encryption equipment that would allow them to document whatever they discovered inside the facility. "Remember," Garcia said as they prepared to move, "our primary objective is intelligence gathering. We're not here to fight unless we have no other choice." "Understood," Sarah replied. But she also understood that in her experience, situations like this rarely went according to plan. When highly trained people with conflicting objectives occupied the same space, violence was usually the result. The approach to the service tunnel took 45 minutes of careful movement across terrain that offered minimal concealment. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible, using shadows and terrain features to mask her progress toward the target. The tunnel entrance was exactly where Garcia's reconnaissance had indicated, hidden beneath a concrete culvert that appeared to be part of the facility's drainage system. Sarah slipped inside first, using night vision equipment to navigate the narrow passage that led toward the research building. The tunnel system was more extensive than either of them had expected. Passages branched off in multiple directions, leading to different areas of the facility and providing access to utility systems that would normally be restricted to maintenance personnel. It was an infiltrator's dream, multiple routes to the objective, and numerous escape options if something went wrong. But it was also a maze, and Sarah was acutely aware that they could easily become lost in the underground network if they weren't careful about navigation. "This way," Garcia whispered, consulting a hand-drawn map she had created during her previous reconnaissance missions. "Research building access should be about 200 meters ahead." They moved through the tunnel system in tactical formation, with Sarah taking point and Garcia covering their rear. The passages were clean and well-maintained, suggesting that Meridian took security seriously even in areas that weren't visible to casual observation. The access point to the research building was secured by an electronic lock that Garcia bypassed using equipment that definitely wasn't available to civilian contractors. Sarah didn't ask where her former team leader had acquired military-grade infiltration tools, but she filed the information away for future consideration. "Building schematics show 3 sublevels," Garcia whispered as they prepared to enter the research facility. "Target data should be on sublevel 3, in the secure archives." Sarah nodded and took point as they moved into the building proper. The basement level was devoted to mechanical systems and utilities, providing them with cover but also limiting their ability to observe potential threats. They moved carefully through equipment rooms and maintenance areas, using building infrastructure to mask their presence. The stairwell to sublevel 3 was monitored by security cameras, but Garcia's intelligence had identified a maintenance shaft that provided alternative access to the lower levels. Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening, grateful for the flexibility training that had been part of her military conditioning. Sublevel 3 was different from the upper floors. The corridors were wider, the lighting was brighter, and the security presence was significantly more obvious. Motion sensors, pressure plates, and what appeared to be a sophisticated intrusion detection system created a web of electronic surveillance that would make movement extremely difficult. "This is more than building security," Sarah whispered. "This is military-grade facility protection." Garcia consulted her notes and pointed toward a corridor that led deeper into the facility. "Archive access should be through there. But we're going to have to deal with that sensor network." Sarah studied the electronic surveillance system, identifying the pattern of sensor coverage and the blind spots that might allow them to reach their objective. It would require precise timing and perfect coordination, but it was possible. "Follow my lead," Sarah said. "Stay exactly in my footsteps and match my timing precisely." They moved through the sensor network like dancers performing a carefully choreographed routine, using Sarah's knowledge of electronic surveillance systems to navigate between detection zones. It took 20 minutes to cover 50 meters, but they reached the archive entrance without triggering any alarms. The archive itself was protected by both electronic locks and biometric scanners, but Garcia had come prepared for that contingency as well. Military intelligence equipment allowed them to bypass the security systems, though Sarah was increasingly concerned about how Garcia had acquired such sophisticated tools. Inside the archive, they found exactly what they had been looking for: detailed documentation of weapons development projects, including complete specifications for the guidance system that had been the objective of Operation Nightfall. But more importantly, they found communications records that proved Garcia's theory about Meridian's involvement in the original mission. "Look at this," Garcia whispered, showing Sarah a series of encrypted messages between Meridian personnel and military officers involved in Nightfall planning. They were providing intelligence about our team's capabilities and mission parameters directly to the people who set up the ambush. Sarah photographed the documents using military-grade equipment that would preserve every detail for later analysis. The communications records were exactly the evidence they needed to prove that Operation Nightfall had been a deliberate setup, designed to field-test Meridian technology while eliminating the soldiers who might testify about what they had witnessed. But as they worked to document the evidence, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold: the sound of booted feet in the corridor outside the archive. Multiple people moving with military precision, apparently conducting some kind of security patrol. "Company," Sarah whispered, gesturing for Garcia to continue photographing while she moved to a position where she could observe the corridor. Through the partially open door, Sarah could see 4 armed guards moving through the facility, with the kind of systematic precision that suggested they were conducting a planned security sweep rather than responding to a specific threat. But their timing was unfortunate. They were moving directly toward the archive where Sarah and Garcia were working. Sarah considered their options. They could try to hide inside the archive and hope the guards didn't conduct a detailed inspection, but that would leave them trapped if the security team decided to investigate further. They could try to withdraw through the route they had used to enter the facility, but that would mean abandoning their mission before they had gathered all the evidence they needed. Or they could eliminate the security team and continue their mission, but that would certainly trigger facility-wide alarms and turn their intelligence-gathering operation into a running firefight. Sarah made the decision that her training demanded. She chose the option that gave them the best chance of completing their mission successfully. Moving with silent precision, she positioned herself to ambush the security patrol as it approached the archive entrance. Garcia continued photographing documents, trusting her former teammate to handle the immediate threat. The first guard entered the archive area without realizing that death was waiting for him in the shadows. Sarah's attack was swift and silent, designed to eliminate the threat without giving him a chance to raise an alarm. The second guard followed a few seconds later and met the same fate. But the third guard was more alert than his companions. He saw the bodies of his teammates and began reaching for his communication equipment before Sarah could reach him. She was forced to move faster than she had planned, and her attack, while successful, was not quite silent enough to avoid detection by the fourth member of the patrol. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Sarah found herself engaged with a professionally trained security operative who understood the tactical advantages of the facility's layout. But Sarah's military experience gave her the edge she needed, and within minutes the immediate threat was eliminated. "Time to go," Garcia said urgently, having completed her photography of the critical documents. "That gunfire is going to bring every security person in the facility down here." Sarah gathered her equipment and began moving toward their planned escape route, but she could already hear the sound of reinforcements converging on their location. Facility alarms were blaring, and the electronic locks that had protected the archive were now working against them, sealing emergency exits and restricting their movement options. "Extraction route compromised," Sarah reported as they moved through corridors that were now brightly lit and filled with the sound of approaching tactical teams. "We need an alternative." Garcia consulted her map of the underground tunnel system. "There's a utility access that leads to the old military installation's command bunker. From there, we can reach the surface about half a mile from the main facility." They moved toward the utility access, but their progress was slowed by the need to avoid security teams that were now conducting a systematic sweep of the entire facility. Sarah's military training served her well as she led Garcia through maintenance areas and utility spaces that provided concealment from the searchers. But as they approached the utility access that would lead them to safety, Sarah heard something that made her realize their situation had become dramatically worse. The sound of helicopters approaching the facility, and radio chatter that indicated federal law enforcement was responding to assist Meridian security. "Blackwood called in federal support," Sarah told Garcia as they reached the utility access. "This is about to become a much bigger operation." Garcia paused at the entrance to the tunnel system. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you before we go any further." Something in Garcia's tone made Sarah turn around and really look at her former teammate. What she saw in Garcia's expression made her hand move instinctively toward her weapon. "This whole operation," Garcia continued, "the safe house, the intelligence about the Nevada facility, the equipment we've been using, it's all been provided by people who want to see Meridian exposed." "What people?" "Military intelligence. A task force that's been investigating defense contractor corruption for the past 2 years. They've been trying to find a way to get inside Meridian's operations legally, but Blackwood's political connections have made that impossible." Sarah felt pieces of another puzzle clicking into place. "So they used us as their unofficial investigation team. They used our desire for revenge to accomplish their own objectives," Garcia admitted. "But the evidence we've gathered tonight is real, and it will be enough to bring down Blackwood and everyone involved in Operation Nightfall." Sarah considered this revelation. She had been manipulated once again. used by people with their own agendas to accomplish objectives that served their interests rather than hers. But the manipulation had led them to the truth about Operation Nightfall, and that truth would finally provide justice for the soldiers who had died in Afghanistan. Extraction plan? Sarah asked. Military intelligence has people waiting to take custody of the evidence and to provide protection while the investigation proceeds. But we have to reach the extraction point without being captured by Meridian security or federal agents who don't know we're working for the good guys. Sarah looked back toward the facility, where she could see searchlights and tactical teams conducting an ever-expanding search for the intruders who had penetrated their most secure installation. Getting out would require all the skills she had learned during 8 years of military service, but it was possible. "Lead the way," Sarah said finally. "But Garcia, after this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about honesty and trust." Garcia nodded grimly. "If we survive the next few hours, I'll tell you everything you want to know about who's really been pulling the strings." They disappeared into the tunnel system as the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. Above ground, the Nevada desert was filling with helicopters, tactical vehicles, and federal agents who were about to discover that sometimes the good guys and the bad guys weren't as easy to distinguish as their training manuals suggested. But in the tunnels beneath the facility, 2 former Marines were carrying evidence that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted them for 3 years. The truth about Operation Nightfall was about to see daylight, and Richard Blackwood was about to learn that some secrets were too dangerous to keep hidden. Sarah Chen had been forced out of retirement, hunted across multiple states, and manipulated by people she had trusted. But she had also accomplished something that had seemed impossible just a week earlier. She had found proof that the soldiers who died in Afghanistan had been betrayed by their own government. Now all she had to do was live long enough to make sure that proof reached the right people. The Marine Combat Master had one more battle to fight, and this time she was fighting for more than survival. This time she was fighting for justice.